Picture this. It's 1318, and you're a minor knight with absolutely no claim to power. Your family name means nothing. Your lands are modest at best. You have zero military achievements worth mentioning. Yet within just 2 years, you'll control every message that reaches the King of England, every appointment in his government, and every penny in his treasury. Sound impossible? Meet Hugh Despenser the Younger, the man who pulled off the most audacious power grab in a medieval history. But here's the thing about climbing too high too fast. The fall doesn't just hurt, it destroys you in ways that make death look merciful. Today we're diving into a story so twisted, so filled with corruption and revenge, that it reads like the darkest political thriller ever written. Except this isn't fiction. This actually happened. We're talking about a man who went from nobody to puppet master of an entire kingdom, only to face an execution so brutal that witnesses struggled to describe it without vomiting. By the end of this story, you'll understand why medieval chroniclers called Hugh Despenser's downfall the most spectacular revenge in English history. But before we get to the blood and the screaming and the very creative uses of red-hot iron, we need to understand how one ordinary knight managed to seize control of the most powerful throne in Europe, because the rise of Hugh Despenser reveals something disturbing about power that still applies today. Sometimes the most dangerous person in the room isn't the one with the crown. It's the one whispering in the crowned person's ear. Let me paint you a picture of medieval England in 1318. King Edward II sits on the throne, but he's nothing like his legendary father Edward Longshanks, the Hammer of the Scots. Where his father was a warrior king who crushed rebellions with his bare hands, Edward II would rather be digging ditches with peasants than commanding armies. Where his father inspired fear and respect across Europe, Edward II inspired mostly confusion and disappointment. This wasn't a king who enjoyed being king. Court chroniclers describe him as more interested in rural crafts than royal duties. He'd disappear from important council meetings to go thatching roofs or working in gardens. Imagine if a modern president abandoned cabinet meetings to go fix plumbing. That's essentially what Edward was doing, and it created a massive power vacuum that someone was going to fill. Enter Hugh Despenser the Younger, a man who understood that the fastest route to power wasn't through the battlefield glory or noble birth. It was through making yourself absolutely indispensable to someone who desperately needed help. Hugh possessed something that medieval England had never seen before in a courtier. He had the patience to play a long game, and the psychological insight to identify exactly what Edward needed most. Emotional support wrapped in administrative competence. The appointment that changed everything happened on a Tuesday morning in March 1318. Edward named Hugh Despenser the Younger as his royal chamberlain. To most observers, this seemed like a minor administrative position, a glorified secretary job for a minor knight. They had no idea they just witnessed the beginning of the most systematic takeover of royal power in English history. Here's what made Hugh's approach so brilliant and so dangerous. Previous royal favorites had been flashy, demanding titles and lands and public recognition. They made enemies by being obvious about their power. Hugh did the opposite. He made himself invisible while making his power absolute. He didn't want to look powerful. He wanted to be powerful. Within weeks of his appointment, Hugh had restructured the entire royal household to funnel through his office. Every letter to the king, every request for an audience, every piece of information that reached Edward's ears, all of it went through Hugh first. And here's where it gets absolutely insane. Hugh didn't just organize this information, he curated it. Picture a typical morning in Edward's court after Hugh took control. The king wakes up and there's already a pile of correspondence waiting. Letters from powerful earls complaining about taxation. Messages from bishops reporting problems in their dioceses. Diplomatic communications from foreign courts. But Edward never sees the raw information. He only sees what Hugh decides he should see. That complaint from the Earl of Lancaster about excessive taxes? Hugh files it away and tells the king that Lancaster sends his loyal greetings. The message from the Bishop of Winchester about corruption in church appointments? Hugh handles it personally and reports that the bishop praised the king's piety. The diplomatic letter from France requesting clarification on trade disputes? Hugh summarizes it as routine pleasantries between royal cousins. This wasn't just information management. This was reality manipulation on a scale that would make modern spin doctors weep with envy. Hugh was creating a version of the world where Edward lived in constant praise and agreement, while Hugh dealt with all the messy details of actual governance. The king got to feel beloved and competent while Hugh accumulated the real power of making decisions. But controlling information was just the foundation of Hugh's scheme. The next step was controlling access. Medieval kingship operated on personal relationships. If you couldn't speak to the king directly, you couldn't influence policy. Hugh turned this system into his personal weapon. By 1319, getting an audience with King Edward required going through Hugh first, and Hugh had developed very specific criteria for who deserved the king's time. Nobles who supported his policies got quick access and long meetings. Those who questioned him found themselves waiting weeks for 5-minute audiences. Anyone who openly opposed him discovered that the king was mysteriously always too busy to see them. The psychological brilliance of this system was that Hugh never said no directly. He just made the process so frustrating and uncertain that people either gave up or came to him with offers. What would it take to expedite a meeting with His Majesty? How could one ensure favorable consideration of a petition? Hugh always had suggestions, and they always involved supporting his agenda or filling his pockets. Lord Berkeley, one of England's most powerful barons, once waited 6 months for a meeting with the king. 6 months. This was a man who controlled thousands of soldiers and vast estates, reduced to cooling his heels in antechambers because Hugh Despenser didn't like the way he'd looked at him during a previous encounter. When Berkeley finally got his audience, it lasted exactly 7 minutes, and the king spent most of it asking about Berkeley's travels rather than discussing the urgent military matters Berkeley had come to address. The financial control came next, and this is where Hugh's system revealed its true scope. Medieval government was essentially personal finance management on a national scale. The king's treasury was the kingdom's treasury. Royal income came from taxes, customs duties, rents from crown lands, and various fees and fines. By 1320, Hugh had inserted himself into every aspect of this financial flow. Here's how brazen this got. Hugh and his father were redirecting approximately 40% of all royal revenue into their personal accounts. Not skimming a little off the top, not taking modest kickbacks. They were systematically looting nearly half of everything the English crown collected. The financial records that survive show they were pulling in over £8,000 annually, enough money to buy entire counties or fund private armies. But the most disturbing part wasn't the scale of the theft. It was how openly they did it. Medieval chronicles record that no royal grant, no legal pardon, no government appointment happened without the Despensers taking their cut. They turned the entire English government into a fee-for-service operation with themselves as the mandatory middlemen. One specific example shows how this worked in practice. A merchant named William de Pillay wanted a license to export wool, one of England's most valuable trade goods. The standard fee for such a license was 20 marks, roughly what a skilled craftsman might earn in 2 years. Hugh demanded 500 marks, plus 10% of all future profits from the trade. When William tried to complain to the king about this extortion, Hugh intercepted the complaint and had William imprisoned for disturbing the royal peace. William's family ended up paying 1,000 marks to secure his release. Think about the psychology of what Hugh had achieved. He'd created a system where complaining about his corruption was itself a crime, where trying to go around him to reach the king was evidence of disloyalty, where the only safe option was to pay whatever he demanded and pretend to be grateful for the privilege. This makes modern political corruption look absolutely amateur by comparison. Today's corrupt officials at least try to hide their schemes through shell companies and offshore accounts. Hugh Despenser was charging admission to see the king and keeping detailed records of his extortion like it was legitimate business. The audacity is almost impressive if it weren't so completely evil. But Hugh's masterstroke wasn't financial or administrative. It was psychological. He'd figured out something about Edward that no previous courtier had understood. The king didn't just need help with royal duties, he needed emotional validation from someone who would never judge him for preferring manual labor to military glory. Hugh provided that unconditional support while using it to control every aspect of Edward's decision-making. Contemporary accounts describe Edward as being completely dependent on Hugh for daily functioning. The king couldn't make decisions without consulting him, couldn't handle stress without Hugh's reassurance, couldn't even maintain his daily routine without Hugh's organization. What looked like friendship was actually the most sophisticated psychological manipulation in medieval politics. This is where Hugh's story becomes a cautionary tale about the danger of unaccountable power. He'd created a system where he controlled information, access, and finances while providing emotional support that made the actual ruler dependent on him. It was the perfect setup for unlimited corruption with zero oversight. But Hugh made one crucial mistake in his calculations. He assumed that destroying potential threats would make his position more secure. He was about to learn that some enemies are too dangerous to provoke, especially when those enemies happen to be queens, with very long memories and very creative approaches to revenge. Because while Hugh was busy turning King Edward into his puppet, he was also systematically destroying the life of Queen Isabella of France. And Isabella was not the kind of woman who forgave personal attacks. She was the kind of woman who spent years planning elaborate vengeance that would make her enemies beg for simple execution. Hugh thought he'd neutralized every threat to his power. He had no idea he was about to face an enemy who would turn his own tactics against him, who would use his methods of systematic destruction to orchestrate one of the most spectacular downfalls in medieval history. The puppet master was about to discover what it felt like to have someone else pulling the strings, and the performance was going to be absolutely unforgettable. But that's a story for the next part of our journey into medieval England's most twisted tale of power, corruption, and revenge. Queen Isabella of France had survived 16 years of medieval marriage, which was no small feat when your husband preferred digging ditches to ruling kingdoms. She'd navigated the treacherous waters of English court politics, produced the required royal heirs, and maintained the delicate diplomatic balance between two nations that loved finding excuses to go to war with each other. She was intelligent, politically savvy, and had earned the respect of foreign courts as a competent queen who knew how to play the game. Then Hugh Despenser decided she was inconvenient. What happened next wasn't just political maneuvering. It was the systematic destruction of a human being, carried out with the kind of methodical cruelty that would make modern psychological warfare specialists take notes. Hugh didn't just want to neutralize Isabella as a political threat. He wanted to break her so completely that she'd never be able to challenge his control over her husband. The campaign began in September 1324, and the excuse was almost laughably thin. England was having one of its periodic conflicts with France, which happened roughly every decade when both kingdoms ran out of other people to fight. Hugh used this diplomatic tension as justification for what he called security measures. In reality, he was about to demonstrate that there's no limit to how creative you can get when destroying someone's life, as long as you have government paperwork to back you up. On a single morning, royal officials arrived simultaneously at 28 different properties across England. These weren't random raids. They were precisely coordinated strikes against every piece of land that provided Isabella with independent income. Estates that had been part of her dowry when she married Edward, properties that had been in her family for generations, holdings that represented not just wealth, but her entire foundation of political power. The seizure documents were identical, stamped with royal seals, written in the formal legal language that made theft sound like administrative necessity. By noon, Isabella had lost approximately £20,000 in annual income. To put that in perspective, most English earls considered themselves wealthy if they controlled lands worth a fraction of that amount. Hugh had just made the Queen of England financially dependent on whatever allowance he decided to give her, but taking her money was just the opening move. Within days, Hugh ordered the arrest of Isabella's household staff. Not all of them, just the ones who'd come with her from France. Her physician, who'd served her family since childhood. Her confessor, who knew all her secrets and fears. Her children's tutors, who'd become like family over the years. 31 people seized in coordinated night raids, thrown into prison cells on charges so vague they might as well have been accused of breathing while French. The message was clear. Being associated with Isabella was dangerous. Supporting her was suspicious. Showing her loyalty was potentially treasonous. Hugh was isolating her by making everyone around her afraid to maintain their relationships with her. Here's where Hugh's psychological warfare gets truly diabolical. He didn't just attack Isabella directly, he went after her children. Prince John, 8 years old, was removed from his mother's household and placed under the care of Hugh's wife. Princess Eleanor, only 6, was shipped off to Despenser properties in Wales. Isabella went from seeing her children daily to being allowed one supervised visit per month, with Hugh's agents present to monitor every word of conversation between a mother and her babies. Imagine the calculation behind this cruelty. Hugh knew that controlling access to her children would torture Isabella more effectively than any physical punishment. He was using her maternal love as a weapon against her, turning her greatest source of joy into a source of constant anxiety and grief. The travel restrictions came next. Isabella couldn't leave court without permission, couldn't visit friends or family without Hugh's approval, couldn't even attend church services without his agents present to ensure she wasn't conducting suspicious activities like praying in French or speaking to other worshippers. Hugh had effectively turned the Queen of England into a prisoner in her own palace. But Hugh's masterpiece of humiliation came during the Christmas celebrations of 1324. This was traditionally the most important social event of the medieval year when the royal family appeared together before the entire court to demonstrate unity and strength. Foreign ambassadors attended. Important nobles brought their families. It was basically medieval England's State of the Union address in party form. Hugh arranged for Isabella to be seated not beside the king, as was her right and tradition, but below the salt. In medieval etiquette, this was the equivalent of making her sit at the children's table, while visiting dignitaries got the places of honor. The symbolism was unmistakable. The Queen of England had been publicly demoted to the status of a minor courtier. The foreign ambassadors were shocked. These were experienced diplomats who'd seen plenty of court intrigue, but they'd never witnessed a queen being humiliated so openly at her own court's most important gathering. Their letters home described the incident as unprecedented and disturbing. Some worried it signaled a complete breakdown in English royal authority. Isabella's own letters from this period, preserved in French archives, reveal the psychological toll of Hugh's campaign. She wrote to her brother, the King of France, describing herself as a prisoner without walls, a queen without authority, a mother without children, a wife without a husband's protection. These weren't the complaints of someone facing normal political opposition. This was the testimony of someone being systematically destroyed. What made Hugh's attack so effective was its legal veneer. Everything he did had proper documentation, royal approval, official justification. He wasn't breaking laws, he was weaponizing them. Medieval bureaucracy became his instrument of torture, with each seizure order and arrest warrant another turn of the screw. The brilliance and the horror of Hugh's method was that it left Isabella with no legitimate recourse. She couldn't complain to the king because Hugh controlled access to Edward. She couldn't appeal to English nobles because they were terrified of being associated with her. She couldn't seek help from France because that would prove Hugh's accusations that she was disloyal to England. Hugh had created the perfect trap. Isabella's attempts to defend herself could be portrayed as evidence of the very disloyalty he accused her of. Her protests could be dismissed as hysteria. Her efforts to maintain relationships with her children, her staff, her friends could all be twisted into proof that she posed a security threat. This is psychological warfare perfected. Hugh understood that you don't need to physically harm someone to destroy them. You just need to systematically remove everything that makes their life worth living while ensuring they have no way to fight back without making themselves look guilty. But Hugh made a crucial error in his calculations. He assumed that breaking Isabella would make her helpless. He thought that isolating her from allies, cutting off her resources, and controlling her access to her own children would leave her too weak to pose any threat to his power. He was wrong, dead wrong. What Hugh didn't understand about Isabella was that she wasn't just any medieval queen. She was the daughter of Philip IV of France, the king who destroyed the Knights Templar when they became inconvenient. She came from a family that specialized in eliminating obstacles with extreme prejudice. She had iron in her bloodline and ice in her veins, and Hugh's campaign of systematic humiliation wasn't breaking her spirit. It was teaching her exactly how to destroy an enemy so completely that they'd beg for death. Every technique Hugh used against her, she was mentally cataloging for future use. Every method of isolation and degradation, she was filing away in her memory. Every legal loophole he exploited, she was noting for her own eventual purposes. Hugh thought he was neutralizing a threat. In reality, he was providing Isabella with a graduate-level education in sophisticated revenge. And Isabella was a very good student. She was learning patience, planning, and the art of making enemies destroy themselves through their own overconfidence. Hugh had no idea that every day he spent tormenting her was another day she spent planning his obliteration. The breaking point came when Hugh made his final fatal mistake. Not content with destroying Isabella's political power, her financial independence, her relationships with her children, and her social standing, he decided to threaten her physical safety. During one of Isabella's rare authorized trips away from court, Hugh withdrew her military escort while she was traveling through contested territory near the Scottish border. This wasn't neglect or bureaucratic oversight. This was attempted murder by abandonment. Hugh was hoping that Scottish raiders would solve his Isabella problem permanently, allowing him to express sorrow at the tragic loss while celebrating privately that his greatest remaining threat had been eliminated. Isabella survived, saved by local monks who provided shelter until she could reach safety. But she got the message. Hugh wasn't just trying to control her anymore. He was trying to kill her. And that crossed a line that transformed Isabella from a defensive victim into an active predator. From that moment, Isabella's entire focus shifted from survival to revenge. She stopped trying to work within Hugh's system and started planning to destroy it completely. She began reaching out to exiled English nobles who'd fled Hugh's purges. She started building relationships with foreign courts who were disturbed by the chaos in England. Most importantly, she began cultivating a very special relationship with Roger Mortimer, an exiled English lord who had his own very personal reasons for wanting Hugh Despenser dead. Hugh thought he'd won. He'd reduced the Queen of England to a powerless, isolated figure who couldn't threaten his control over Edward. He had no idea that he'd actually created the architect of his own destruction. Isabella wasn't broken. She was transformed into something far more dangerous than the conventional queen she'd once been. She was now a woman with nothing left to lose and everything to gain from Hugh's complete annihilation. And she was about to demonstrate that the most dangerous enemy is the one you think you've already defeated. The puppet master was about to learn what it felt like when someone started pulling his strings. And the performance Isabella had planned for him would make his systematic destruction of her look like a gentle warm-up act. The transformation of Queen Isabella from victim to predator wasn't immediate. It was methodical, calculated, and absolutely terrifying in its precision. While Hugh celebrated what he thought was his complete victory over the French queen, Isabella was quietly assembling the most sophisticated revenge operation medieval Europe had ever witnessed. She wasn't just planning Hugh's death, she was orchestrating his total obliteration in ways that would make his systematic destruction of her look like amateur hour. The first phase of Isabella's master plan required something Hugh had never expected from her: patience. For months after the incident with the withdrawn military escort, Isabella played the part of the broken queen perfectly. She attended court functions with downcast eyes. She accepted Hugh's restrictions without protest. She even thanked him publicly for his concern for her safety. To every observer, including Hugh himself, Isabella appeared to be a defeated woman who'd finally accepted her powerless position. This was performance art at its finest. While Hugh congratulated himself on successfully neutralizing the queen, Isabella was using her apparent submission as camouflage for the most extensive intelligence operation in medieval political history. Every servant who felt sorry for the humiliated queen became a potential source of information. Every noble who was disgusted by Hugh's treatment of her became a possible ally. Every foreign diplomat who witnessed her degradation became a contact in her growing network. Here's what made Isabella's approach so brilliant and so different from Hugh's crude methods. Hugh had used fear and intimidation to control people. Isabella used sympathy and shared grievance. Hugh had isolated himself by making enemies. Isabella connected with people by being the victim of their common enemy. Hugh had accumulated power by taking it from others. Isabella was about to acquire power by giving people what they desperately wanted, a chance to destroy the man who'd been tormenting them all. The key to understanding Isabella's strategy is recognizing that Hugh had made one crucial error in his reign of terror. He'd been so focused on consolidating power that he'd forgotten the basic rule of medieval politics. Today's victim might be tomorrow's executioner. By systematically destroying anyone who opposed him, Hugh had created a vast network of people with very personal reasons for wanting him dead. Isabella began reaching out to these exiled and dispossessed nobles, not with grand promises of political restoration, but with something much more compelling: detailed plans for Hugh's destruction. She wasn't asking them to trust her with their futures. She was inviting them to participate in crafting his doom. The masterstroke of Isabella's recruitment campaign was her partnership with Roger Mortimer, an exiled English lord who'd escaped from the Tower of London in one of the most daring prison breaks in medieval history. Mortimer wasn't just another disgruntled noble. He was a military genius who'd spent years fighting in Wales and Ireland, a man who understood warfare, strategy, and the art of turning enemies against each other. More importantly, Mortimer had his own intensely personal grudge against Hugh. The Despensers had seized his ancestral lands, imprisoned his family members, and forced him into exile, where he'd watched helplessly as his life's work was divided among Hugh's supporters. This wasn't just political opposition. This was blood-deep hatred between two men who'd destroyed each other's worlds. But here's where Isabella's plan reveals its true sophistication. She didn't just recruit Mortimer as a military ally. She seduced him as a lover, creating a bond that went far beyond political convenience. This wasn't romance in any conventional sense. This was the weaponization of intimacy, the transformation of personal relationship into political weapon. The affair between Isabella and Mortimer wasn't hidden from their enemies. It was flaunted as a deliberate provocation. Isabella wanted Hugh to know that she'd found someone who could provide everything Edward couldn't: military expertise, political cunning, and the kind of passionate dedication that would drive a man to risk everything for revenge. The psychological warfare aspect of this relationship was devastating. Hugh had spent years portraying Isabella as a helpless foreign woman who needed to be controlled for England's safety. Now she was openly consorting with England's most dangerous exile, proving that she was neither helpless nor controllable. The narrative Hugh had constructed about weak women requiring masculine guidance was crumbling before his eyes. Isabella's next move was to secure international support, and this is where her years of diplomatic experience proved invaluable. She reached out to her brother Charles, King of France, not as a sister seeking family protection, but as a political operative offering strategic alliance. She promised Charles that removing Hugh would restore proper relations between England and France, ending the diplomatic chaos that Hugh's policies had created. The French court's response was immediate and enthusiastic. They'd been dealing with the diplomatic nightmare of Hugh's influence for years, watching helplessly as reasonable negotiations were sabotaged by his paranoid policies and extractive demands. Isabella wasn't just offering them revenge, she was promising them competent government in England. But Isabella's most brilliant recruitment was entirely unexpected. She began cultivating support among English church leaders who'd grown disgusted with Hugh's corruption of royal authority. Medieval bishops weren't just spiritual leaders. They were political powers who controlled vast resources and commanded the loyalty of common people who might not care about noble feuds but definitely cared about religious authority. Hugh had made enemies in the church through his systematic looting of royal resources that traditionally supported religious institutions. Monasteries that depended on royal patronage found their funding diverted to Hugh's personal projects. Bishops who expected consultation on important decisions discovered that Hugh made policy without considering ecclesiastical concerns. The church hierarchy began to see Hugh not just as corrupt, but as actively hostile to religious authority. Isabella presented these church leaders with a compelling theological argument. Hugh's influence over Edward represented a fundamental disorder in God's plan for kingship. A king who allowed himself to be controlled by a subject was violating divine authority. A husband who permitted his wife to be humiliated was failing in his sacred duty. The corruption of royal power was literally a sin against heaven that required correction. This religious dimension gave Isabella's conspiracy something Hugh's regime had never possessed: moral legitimacy. She wasn't just gathering political opportunists and personal enemies. She was assembling a coalition that could claim divine sanction for removing Hugh from power. The military planning began in earnest during the summer of 1325, when Isabella received permission to travel to France for diplomatic negotiations. Hugh actually supported this trip, seeing it as an opportunity to get the troublesome queen out of England while he consolidated his control even further. He had no idea that Isabella was about to use French resources to launch the most sophisticated invasion in medieval English history. The invasion force that Isabella and Mortimer assembled wasn't massive by medieval standards, but it was perfectly designed for their specific mission. Rather than bringing a huge army that would trigger widespread warfare, they recruited a small, elite force of exiled English nobles and experienced mercenaries. These weren't foreign conquerors, they were English patriots, returning to liberate their homeland from a corrupt usurper. The propaganda campaign that preceded the invasion was a masterpiece of medieval public relations. Isabella didn't present herself as a wronged wife seeking personal revenge. She portrayed herself as England's savior, returning to rescue the kingdom from a regime that had corrupted royal authority, destroyed noble families, and threatened the natural order that God had established. The message was simple and compelling. Edward wasn't really ruling England. Hugh was. And Hugh's rule was illegitimate, corrupt, and dangerous to everyone who valued traditional English freedoms. Isabella wasn't coming to overthrow the king. She was coming to liberate him from the evil counselor who'd enslaved him. This narrative was devastatingly effective because it contained just enough truth to be believable, while providing a comfortable fiction that allowed people to support Isabella without feeling like traitors to royal authority. They weren't rebelling against their king. They were rescuing him from a manipulative favorite who'd exceeded all proper bounds. When Isabella's small invasion force landed in England in September 1326, the response was immediate and overwhelming. Nobles who'd been terrorized by Hugh's regime for years suddenly found the courage to declare their support for the queen. Common people who'd suffered under the taxation and corruption that funded Hugh's lifestyle welcomed the invaders as liberators. Most importantly, Edward's own military commanders began defecting to Isabella's cause. These weren't men who'd been bribed or coerced. These were professional soldiers who'd watched Hugh's corruption destroy military effectiveness and undermine royal authority. They genuinely believed that supporting Isabella was supporting legitimate kingship against illegitimate usurpation. Hugh's response to the invasion revealed how completely he'd misunderstood the political situation he'd created. Instead of recognizing that his years of systematic oppression had created a vast coalition of enemies, he assumed that a show of force would intimidate people back into submission. He demanded that Edward raise armies to crush the rebellion, apparently believing that the same fear tactics that had worked for years would continue working now. But Hugh had forgotten the most basic rule of medieval politics. Military force only works when people believe in your right to use it. The soldiers Hugh expected to fight for him had watched him corrupt everything they'd sworn to protect. The nobles he demanded support from had spent years being systematically robbed and humiliated by his regime. The common people he needed to provide resources had been crushed under taxation, designed to fund his personal enrichment. Nobody was willing to fight for Hugh Despenser anymore, because nobody believed he represented anything worth defending. Isabella had successfully transformed him from the power behind the throne into exactly what he'd always been: a corrupt opportunist who'd finally pushed his luck too far. The psychological transformation was complete. Hugh went from being the man who controlled everyone's access to power to being the man everyone wanted to see destroyed. From puppet master to hunted criminal in the span of weeks. From the person who decided other people's fates to someone desperately fleeing for his life while his enemies closed in from all sides. Isabella had achieved something remarkable. She'd turned Hugh's own methods against him so effectively that his destruction became not just inevitable, but welcomed by virtually everyone who'd been forced to endure his regime. The systematic humiliation he'd inflicted on her was about to be returned with interest that would compound into the most spectacular execution in medieval English history. But before we get to the truly horrific details of Hugh's final moments, we need to understand how a man who'd controlled an entire kingdom ended up completely alone, abandoned by everyone who'd once feared him, facing enemies who'd spent years planning exactly how to make his death as prolonged and agonizing as possible. Because the real lesson of Hugh Despenser's story isn't just about the dangers of absolute power. It's about the fatal mistake of believing that fear and intimidation can substitute for genuine loyalty. Hugh had confused submission with support, terror with respect. When the test came, he discovered that people who submit to you out of fear will abandon you the moment someone stronger appears. Isabella hadn't just defeated Hugh. She'd revealed him to be exactly what he'd always been, a bully who'd finally encountered someone willing and able to fight back. And medieval England was about to witness what happened when years of accumulated hatred found its perfect outlet in one man's systematic destruction. The collapse of Hugh Despenser's power wasn't gradual. It was a complete avalanche that buried him so quickly, he barely had time to understand what was happening. In just 3 weeks, Hugh went from controlling every aspect of English government to fleeing through Welsh forests like a common criminal, abandoned by everyone who'd once scrambled to curry his favor. When news reached London that Queen Isabella had landed with an invasion force, Hugh's first reaction was classic overconfidence. He assumed this was just another political challenge that could be managed through his usual methods of intimidation and bribery. After all, he'd spent years crushing opposition through systematic terror. Why would this be any different? Hugh demanded that King Edward raise the royal army to crush the rebellion. He ordered the seizure of lands belonging to anyone suspected of supporting Isabella. He issued warrants for the arrest of nobles who'd failed to immediately declare their loyalty to the crown. These were the same tactics that had worked perfectly for nearly a decade. Except now they accomplished absolutely nothing beyond revealing how completely isolated Hugh had become. The military commanders Hugh expected to obey his orders simply ignored them. The nobles he demanded support from either fled to join Isabella or quietly disappeared from court. The bureaucrats who'd implemented his policies for years suddenly discovered urgent business elsewhere. Within days, Hugh found himself giving orders to empty rooms while Edward wandered the palace in confused panic. Unable to understand why nobody was listening to him anymore, here's what Hugh had never grasped about medieval power structures. Fear only works as long as people believe you can actually hurt them. The moment someone stronger appears, everyone who'd been terrorized into submission immediately switches sides. Hugh had built his entire system on intimidation rather than genuine loyalty, and intimidation has a fatal weakness. It evaporates the second people stop being afraid. Isabella's psychological warfare campaign had been devastatingly effective, precisely because it gave people permission to stop being afraid. By presenting herself as England's legitimate protector returning to save the kingdom from corruption, she transformed resistance to Hugh from dangerous rebellion into patriotic duty. Supporting Hugh now made you a traitor to England. Opposing him made you a hero. The speed of Hugh's abandonment was breathtaking. Lords who'd spent years praising his wisdom suddenly remembered urgent business in distant counties. Servants who'd competed for his attention began avoiding eye contact in corridors. Even his own household staff started making excuses to leave his service. The man who'd controlled access to everyone else discovered that nobody wanted access to him. Edward's reaction to the crisis revealed just how completely dependent he'd become on Hugh's management. Without his chamberlain organizing his schedule, filtering his information, and making his decisions, the king simply shut down. Contemporary accounts describe Edward wandering through his own palace like a lost child, asking anyone he encountered what he should do next. The puppet had been cut from his strings and had no idea how to move independently. But Hugh's most devastating realization was that the system he'd created to protect himself was now being used to destroy him. Every method of legal persecution he'd perfected, every technique of administrative harassment he'd developed, every loophole he'd exploited to crush his enemies, Isabella and Mortimer were now deploying all of these against him with surgical precision. The property seizures began immediately. Within days of Isabella's landing, royal writs were issued confiscating every estate Hugh had stolen over the years. The same legal language he'd used to justify his thefts was now being used to reclaim them. The same bureaucratic machinery he'd corrupted to serve his interest was grinding him up with a methodical efficiency. Hugh's financial accounts were frozen. His supporters were arrested on charges identical to the ones he'd used against his own enemies. His correspondence was intercepted and examined for evidence of treason. Every weapon he'd forged in his years of systematic oppression was now pointed directly at him. The psychological torment of this reversal cannot be overstated. Hugh was experiencing exactly what he'd inflicted on hundreds of others, but with the added horror of knowing precisely how the process worked, because he'd designed it himself. Every seizure order, every arrest warrant, every legal manipulation, he recognized his own methods being turned against him with devastating effectiveness. The abandonment by his allies revealed the hollow foundation of Hugh's power. The nobles who'd supported him hadn't done so out of respect or genuine loyalty. They'd calculated that backing Hugh was safer than opposing him. The moment that calculation changed, their support evaporated instantly. Medieval politics was brutally transactional, and Hugh's account had just been declared bankrupt. King Edward's desperate attempts to rally support for his favorite only accelerated the collapse. When the king issued proclamations demanding loyalty to Hugh, the response was either silence or open defiance. When he tried to raise armies to fight Isabella, potential soldiers simply refused to serve. When he threatened punishment for those who wouldn't support his chamberlain, people laughed at threats from a king who clearly couldn't protect himself, let alone punish others. The flight from London marked the beginning of Hugh's final humiliation. The man who'd once controlled England's capital from a luxurious palace found himself sneaking out of the city at night, disguised as a common merchant, carrying only what he could fit in saddlebags. The contrast between his former power and his current desperation would have been almost comical if the consequences hadn't been so deadly. Hugh's attempt to rally support in Wales, where he controlled the most territory, proved that owning land means nothing if the people on that land want you dead. The Welsh lords who'd been forced to accept his authority through threats and legal manipulation saw Isabella's invasion as their opportunity for revenge. Instead of providing sanctuary, they actively hunted Hugh through their own territories, competing to be the ones who captured him for the queen. The psychological breakdown was visible to everyone who encountered Hugh during his flight. Contemporary accounts describe a man who'd aged years and weeks, jumping at shadows, unable to sleep, constantly looking over his shoulder for enemies who were very real and getting closer every day. The confidence and calculated cruelty that had defined his personality for years had been replaced by paranoid terror. Edward's complete dependence on Hugh became a liability that sealed both their fates. The king couldn't function without his chamberlain's guidance, but Hugh's presence made Edward radioactive to potential supporters who might have been willing to help a king without his corrupt favorite. They were trapped together in a relationship that had become mutually destructive. The final irony of Hugh's downfall was that his own success had made his destruction inevitable. By concentrating so much power in his hands, by making so many enemies, by building a system based entirely on fear and intimidation, Hugh had created the perfect conditions for a spectacular collapse. He'd made himself so essential that removing him would cripple the government, which gave his enemies enormous incentive to remove him completely. Isabella and Mortimer understood this dynamic perfectly. They knew that capturing Hugh alive would be far more valuable than killing him quickly. A dead Hugh might become a martyr to some supporters. A living Hugh, publicly humiliated and systematically destroyed, would serve as the ultimate proof that his reign of terror was permanently over. The hunt for Hugh became a national obsession. Rewards were offered for information about his location. Patrols scoured the countryside. Local officials competed to prove their loyalty to Isabella by demonstrating their enthusiasm for capturing her greatest enemy. The entire kingdom was mobilized to track down one man who'd once controlled them all. When Hugh was finally cornered in November 1326, hiding in a forest in Wales, he'd been reduced to something barely recognizable as the powerful courtier who'd once terrified English nobility. Weeks of constant flight, inadequate food, and psychological terror had transformed him into a broken wreck of a man who could barely stand without assistance. The capture itself was anticlimactic. Hugh didn't fight. He didn't try to negotiate. He didn't even attempt to maintain his dignity. He simply collapsed when Isabella's soldiers surrounded him, weeping openly as they bound his hands. The puppet master's strings had been cut permanently, and all that remained was the puppet, empty and powerless and completely at the mercy of people who had no intention of showing him any. But Hugh's capture was just the beginning of Isabella's revenge, not the culmination. The Queen had spent months planning exactly how to make Hugh's final days a masterpiece of systematic humiliation that would demonstrate to everyone what happened to those who dared to abuse royal power. The broken man they'd dragged from the Welsh forest was about to become the star of the most elaborate execution spectacle medieval England had ever witnessed. Isabella hadn't just defeated Hugh Despenser. She'd broken him so completely that his destruction would serve as a warning that would echo through English politics for generations. The rise and fall of Hugh Despenser was about to become the cautionary tale that defined how medieval England thought about power, corruption, and the terrible price of pushing too far. The stage was set. The audience was gathering. And Hugh Despenser was about to discover that sometimes the most dangerous enemy isn't the one with the crown. It's the one with nothing left to lose and all the time in the world to make you pay for every moment of suffering you've caused. The execution of Hugh Despenser wasn't just about killing a hated enemy. It was about creating a spectacle so horrifying that no one would ever forget what happens when you push a kingdom too far. November 24th, 1326. The city of Hereford had transformed itself into medieval England's theater of vengeance. Dawn broke over a scene that defied normal execution protocols. This wasn't going to be a quick hanging followed by burial. Isabella had commissioned something unprecedented, a 3-story viewing platform built specifically for optimal sightlines of the execution ground. Thousands had traveled for days to witness this event. Street vendors hawked food and commemorative trinkets. Musicians warmed up the crowd like this was a festival rather than a man's final moments. Queen Isabella sat in her specially constructed royal box, wine and refreshments laid out as if she were attending a tournament rather than an execution. This wasn't coincidental. Every element had been choreographed for maximum psychological impact, both on Hugh and on every witness who would carry this memory for the rest of their lives. The preparation began with ritual humiliation, designed to strip away every vestige of Hugh's former dignity. He was dragged from his cell completely naked, denied even the basic covering typically afforded to condemned prisoners. But nudity wasn't sufficient. They shaved his entire body, removing every hair from his head and face, transforming the once powerful Chamberlain into something that barely resembled human dignity. Contemporary chroniclers noted the crowd's delight at seeing the man who'd terrorized them reduced to this pitiful state. But the humiliation was just beginning. Biblical verses about betrayal and corruption were painted on his skin with ink mixed with pig's blood. Words like traitor across his forehead, usurper down his spine. Each inscription was carefully chosen for maximum theological and political impact. The crown they placed on his head wasn't made of gold or silver. It was woven from stinging nettles, those venomous plants that cause excruciating skin reactions. Hugh's scalp immediately began swelling and blistering, ensuring constant agony even before the real torture began. The executioners had selected the most toxic varieties, guaranteeing that every moment would be filled with pain. The procession route through Hereford had been precisely planned for maximum humiliation. Hugh was tied backwards to horses, facing their tails, a special degradation reserved for the worst traitors. The path wound through market streets where merchants pelted him with rotten produce. past churches where priests read condemnations of his crimes, through neighborhoods where families he'd destroyed could witness his downfall. Every yard of the route was lined with Hugh's victims, people whose lands he'd stolen, whose family members he'd imprisoned, whose lives he'd ruined through the years of systematic corruption. This wasn't just an execution procession. It was a parade of justice where every spectator had personal reasons for celebration. The scaffold itself was an architectural marvel of engineered cruelty. 3 stories high with pulleys and platforms that allowed the executioners to display Hugh at various heights and angles. The crowd could see everything. Musicians played between torture sessions, creating a grotesque rhythm of agony and anticipation that turned systematic murder into performance art. The execution sequence followed legal protocols, but with creative elaborations that pushed medieval justice into realms of spectacular cruelty. First came partial hanging, but this wasn't designed to kill quickly. Hugh was raised by the neck just enough to cut off air, then lowered at precisely calculated intervals to prevent death. The executioner counted breaths like a musician keeping time, ensuring Hugh remained conscious for what came next. The castration that followed wasn't swift or merciful. The executioner heated his blade in a brazier, ensuring cauterization to prevent Hugh from bleeding out too quickly. His manhood was removed slowly, methodically, then burned in front of his eyes in a special iron basket. Contemporary accounts record that Hugh was forced to watch his own flesh become ash, while the crowd celebrated each moment of his agony. The disembowelment pushed medieval execution into territories that modern minds struggle to comprehend. Rather than quick cuts designed to end suffering, the executioner made precise incisions that extracted Hugh's intestines slowly enough to keep him conscious. His entrails were burned while still attached to his body, so he could feel the heat traveling through his torso. Throughout this systematic destruction, a priest stood nearby reading charges between each act of torture: theft of royal lands, corruption of the king, abuse of royal power. Each accusation was punctuated by fresh agony, turning Hugh's execution into a legal proceeding where his body served as evidence of his crimes. The crowd participated with enthusiasm that revealed the depths of their accumulated hatred. They cheered each torture. They counted along with the executioner's breathing exercises during the hanging intervals. They sang songs mocking Hugh's former power. This wasn't passive observation. It was collective participation in the systematic destruction of a man they'd been forced to fear for years. 4 hours. That's how long Isabella's revenge lasted. 4 hours of methodical torture designed to extract maximum suffering while keeping Hugh conscious for every moment. When the beheading finally came, it was almost merciful by comparison, though even this final act took 3 strikes to complete. Whether this was deliberate prolonging or executioner incompetence, no one recorded. But death wasn't the end of Hugh's public service to English justice. His quartered corpse was about to embark on a grotesque tour of the kingdom. The crowd voted on which body parts would go to which cities, turning the distribution of his remains into a democratic exercise. London got the head for display on the bridge. York received an arm, Bristol got the other arm. Each quarter became a regional warning about the consequences of abusing power. The head's journey to London Bridge took 5 days, with scheduled stops in major towns for public viewing. Worcester, Oxford, and Reading all got preview displays before Hugh's remains reached their permanent exhibition site. London Bridge already hosted dozens of traitors' heads in various stages of decay, but Hugh's received premium placement where everyone entering the capital would see it. This wasn't random vindictiveness. It was calculated political messaging using human remains as the medium. Every town that displayed a piece of Hugh reminded potential troublemakers that medieval justice didn't end with death. Your corpse could have a longer and more public career than your life. The preservation techniques reveal the sophisticated infrastructure required to maintain this mobile exhibition of justice. The head was dipped in tar to slow decomposition. Special iron cages balanced security with visibility. Display heights were calculated for maximum impact without enabling theft. Cities actually budgeted for Despenser display expenses, creating jobs around exhibiting his remains. Isabella's revenge had achieved something remarkable. She'd transformed Hugh from a person into a symbol, from a corrupt individual into a permanent warning about the dangers of absolute power. His quartered corpse would spend the next 4 years touring England, reminding everyone what happened to those who pushed royal authority too far. The psychological impact extended far beyond the immediate spectacle. Every noble who'd watched Hugh's systematic torture understood that medieval power was ultimately temporary. Every bureaucrat who'd implemented his corrupt policies recognized that today's enforcer could be tomorrow's victim. Every courtier learned that proximity to power was no guarantee of protection when that power collapsed. Hugh Despenser's rise and fall became the definitive cautionary tale about medieval corruption. His story demonstrated that fear and intimidation might create temporary submission, but they could never generate the genuine loyalty needed to survive political crisis. When the test came, Hugh discovered that people who obeyed him from terror would abandon him the moment someone stronger appeared. Queen Isabella had achieved the perfect revenge. She hadn't just killed her tormentor. She'd obliterated him so completely that his name became synonymous with the dangers of unchecked power. His execution became the gold standard for spectacular justice. His quartered remains became permanent monuments to royal authority. The man who'd once controlled every aspect of English government ended his career as a gruesome tourist attraction, his body parts serving as civic landmarks that children used as meeting points. From puppet master to public spectacle, from kingmaker to cautionary tale, from the height of medieval power to its most spectacular downfall, Hugh Despenser's story reminds us that absolute power might seem absolutely corrupting, but it's also absolutely temporary. Every tyrant eventually faces their reckoning. Every system built on fear eventually collapses from within. Every puppet master eventually discovers that someone else is pulling the strings. In medieval England, justice wasn't just about punishment. It was about creating memories so powerful they would shape behavior for generations. Hugh Despenser's 4-hour execution and 4-year exhibition achieved exactly that, turning one man's spectacular downfall into a permanent lesson about power, corruption, and the terrible price of pushing too far. The rise and fall of Hugh Despenser proves that sometimes the most dangerous enemy isn't the one with the crown. It's the one with nothing left to lose, all the time in the world to plan revenge, and the creativity to make that revenge unforgettable.